Thank you, Katie, and thanks everybody for being here this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all and to get to know your communities a little bit better. So I know that we are doing a kind of a switch up on the agenda, so I'll try to get through all of my slides in the next 20 minutes or so. I don't know if I can do that, but just give me a warning. I don't want to keep people from their food, especially not in the morning. So like Katie said with her kind introduction, I've been working with rural communities for the last 20 years. I actually grew up not too far from here. I lived in the Cadillac area outside of McBain and Marion. So driving here from Traverse City, where I live now, was kind of a nice trip down memory lane. So I haven't worked in this region for much of my career, but one of the things that I love most about my job and have loved most about my job for the last 20 years is just getting to know communities and the people that work in them and what they're trying to make happen and how I can work with you all. So appreciate the chance to be here this morning. As Katie mentioned, I'm the director of the Michigan Office of Rural Development, which is a newish office. I had to add the ish on there because we're over a year old now. I've been in this position for over a year. The office itself was created by Governor Whitmer through an executive order early in 2022. And it was, the creation of the office was rooted in the understanding that if Michigan is going to be successful and competitive nationally and over the long term, we really need the whole state to be successful. We need the whole state and all of its communities to be attractive to new residents and to new businesses. And it also recognizes that our economy is inextricably interconnected between urban and rural markets. We know that what happens in rural Michigan really affects urban areas in Michigan and vice versa. Michigan's tourism, its manufacturing, its food exports, all of those really big economic drivers are inextricably connected to the assets that we have in rural Michigan. So we know that rural Michigan has to be successful if Michigan is going to be successful, but we also know that rural Michigan has a lot of challenges, many of which are very similar to what we have in urban markets and urban communities. But solutions in rural Michigan often look a little bit different or a lot different than what you would attempt in more urban areas because of the geography, because of the scale, because of the resources that are available. So we know that we need rural-specific solutions to a lot of the challenges that we face in our communities. And the Office of Rural Development was really intended to be a voice on that front, really making sure that the unique solutions and unique challenges that rural communities are experiencing are a part of the policy making process, policy making conversations, and program development that's happening in Lansing. Before I go any farther with talking about some of those specific needs and solutions, I just want to clarify here what we mean by rural, because if I don't, I think everyone will wonder which communities I'm talking about. And what I usually preface all of this with is the fact that there are as many definitions of rural as there are agencies or researchers that are talking about rural. So the USDA has a definition, MSHDA has a definition, MEDC has a definition, and it can really, the definition can really change the story that we're hearing or the data that we're collecting about the community that we're talking about. So we try to be very conscious of this and also aware that when we're talking about rural communities, we're not speaking into an informational vacuum. There's a lot of messages out there about rural communities in the media right now, and so I read a lot of whatever I see in the news about rural. I read it, and one of the narratives that I come across regularly is that rural America is in decline, and that we have this essentially a crisis in rural communities, that we are experiencing in rural communities a lot of economic distress. And those narratives are generally built around data that uses a certain definition of rural based on the connections between urban and rural communities and economies. So these non-metropolitan definitions really point towards a lot of economic decline, where on the other hand, you'll sometimes see stories about rural America where communities are growing and thriving, and we have people moving in big groups back to rural communities. These definitions are generally based on definitions that strictly use population. So they're often capturing growth that happens near metro areas or just straight population growth in rural communities. But the result is that we have vastly different definitions and narratives about rural Michigan, and both of them are true. And it can make it very difficult to communicate what needs are in rural Michigan and rural America, because it is true that we have a lot of communities that are experiencing distress and that have a lot of economic decline and need a lot of additional resources. And we also have communities that are experiencing the complete opposite, where there's so much growth that communities can't really manage it effectively, and that it's affecting housing prices and income equality and these kinds of trends. So what it boils down to is it makes it hard to develop policy that's just universal for rural communities on the one hand, and it also makes it hard to talk about. And so when you have a subject that's hard to talk about, it makes it doubly difficult to develop policy. But what we're trying to communicate when we talk about rural communities is that they're all unique, that we really need to meet communities where they are and look at their unique assets, look at the trends that they're experiencing in real time, and try to find an approach that's not one size fits all for rural communities. So again, that's a difficult thing to translate into policy or programs, but it's what we're trying to build into the conversations that we're having is let's look for some flexibility here in how we approach rural communities. So having kind of laid that foundation, I'll just say that, by more standard definitions of rural, we're right in the middle of it here in Gladwin today. There's I think by one count, 94% of the state's geography is rural and 20% of the population. So that gives you kind of just a general sense of where we are. And what we're seeing in many of those rural communities, or maybe all of them, is some really significant population and demographic trends that are kind of changing the landscape and the economy in big ways and have been for a long time. The biggest thing that I hear about when I visit other communities across the state, doesn't matter where I am, whether I'm in the Western UP or Southwest Michigan, we have an aging population, or in some cases a population that has declined, and that is really putting a lot of pressure on workforce. And so we have a workforce shortage in many or most, if not all, of our rural communities. In some cases, in most cases, I would say across all sectors. In some cases, we have such an acute shortage of specific types of workers that we aren't able to fill essential positions. I think the one that comes up most regularly is emergency response. So a lot of communities are struggling to find people to drive ambulances. We have a lot of people who are struggling to find teachers, partially because of housing values or availability. We have a lot of pressure just in healthcare in general. But across the board, there is this really big sense of urgency around building our workforce or rebuilding our workforce so that we can essentially serve our communities. We have a lot of communities who, like I said, are kind of in this crisis situation where they're really forced into, while they're looking at long-term solutions, they're also kind of backed into more immediate solutions to address those urgent community needs. So that looks like a lot of partnerships, a lot of shared services, kind of stretching what's available across bigger geographies in order to meet the community's needs. All of this is, I guess a couple of things I'll say here. Where we have declining populations, it would seem on the surface that you would also have a lot of available housing. That's not the case. What we have in most communities is a housing shortage, and that's partially a result of just demographic changes to household size and just sort of the where we are with the age of our population. But we have housing shortages in most of our communities, and it's making it really difficult to attract and recruit new employees back to those communities. So when I'm talking with groups like yours today, again, doesn't really matter where I am, everyone kind of recognizes that at this point, if we're going to do anything about the workforce, we have to simultaneously work really hard on addressing the housing needs that our communities have. So that's been a really prevalent theme in all of the conversations that I've had across Michigan. So this has been, I guess I should, before I move any farther, I can't overstate the importance of these demographic trends to rural Michigan. And I would say that rural Michigan has been kind of the canary in the coal mine in a lot of ways for what we're experiencing at the state level. We started losing population before other parts of the state have. We've experienced it more acutely because we had smaller populations to begin with, and what we are told and what is being predicted right now is that the trends that we're experiencing in rural Michigan are really going to spread across the state if we're not proactive about addressing it now. So this map that you see here is forecasted population change through 2050, and you can see that where we have lost most of our population loss has been in rural communities. That will be the case across the state. And that's really going to affect not just the workforce needs that we've had in the past and the associated health outcomes, educational attainment, income of new and existing residents, but it's also going to affect our revenues at the local and state level. So when we think about losing people, we're also losing all of their income and their tax dollars too, as well as their businesses and that revenue. So we really need to be strategic about how we think about this. And before I go any farther down this path of doom and gloom, just want to say that the forecast here is based on current population trends. So this is what we've seen over the last 20 years, kind of projected out into the future. But what we have seen over the last couple years tells us a much different story. And so this is a much more optimistic slide here, and I think really kind of gets to the meat of what we're doing at the local level in communities and more broadly at the state level to be proactive about addressing some of those big, complex statewide challenges. What this map shows is population change over the last couple years, and you can see that even in those communities that have lost population for decades, we're seeing people come back. And the reason for that, there's many reasons for that, but I would say that the seeds for this change were planted many years ago when communities started to recognize what was happening to their population and started investing in their communities, investing in place, and investing in people and the services that serve those people. So building that infrastructure and creating a place that is desirable for people to live in and do business in is really key to changing some of those really significant population trends that we've been seeing. One of the things that has really kind of turned everything on its head, a couple of the things that have turned everything on its head, with the pandemic, there was an acceleration in terms of the number of people who were able to work remotely. So all of a sudden we had people who were deciding where they wanted to live rather than where they wanted to work. And it turns out that a lot of those people want to live in more rural areas and areas that have a lot of access to the outdoors and access to outdoor recreation. And so the communities that have invested more heavily in building up those recreation amenities and creating that kind of access to recreation have been more successful in bringing people back to their communities. So this is, there's some anecdotal, this is somewhat anecdotal, but there's also a lot of research showing that population migration trends are really pointing towards those recreation-dependent communities. Rural Michigan is really well positioned to take advantage of the interests that people have, both in remote work and in access to outdoor recreation. The other thing that's been a really big topic of conversation in terms of migration trends is climate change. And so with all of the disasters that are happening everywhere in the world and in the country, so wildfires last week, floods this week, hurricanes this week, floods earlier this year, wherever you go in the country, there's been some pretty catastrophic weather events. And Michigan is identified as a climate sanctuary, so our weather patterns are more predictable and a little bit safer. So the conventional wisdom is that as these weather events continue to worsen, people will come to Michigan just for more security and stability. That is happening. I think we have some anecdotal evidence to that end, but it's something that really requires us to position ourselves and be strategic if we're going to capture the interest of people who are considering a move because of weather events. And that's something that we haven't done as a state until now. So the governor created this summer the Growing Michigan Together Commission that's really taking a higher level look at all of these trends and opportunities and how we can reverse some of the decline that we've started to experience as a state in terms of population. So it really puts a focus on what we need to do to be proactive and strategic to capture some of that potential for new growth. And I think we have a good foundation for that because we've had so much success in our rural communities that have shown us if we do invest in people, if we do invest in place, we can attract this broader investment and find solutions to some of the challenges that we're really struggling with as communities. So when I talk to communities across Michigan, the question often is like, they generally know what the problems are. They want to know what's working. So what are other communities doing that's resulting in more housing, that's helping them build trails, that's helping them meet some of their workforce needs. And there's not a single recipe for success other than to say that the communities that have been successful are the ones that have done the planning and that have worked across sectors with different types of partners. So every community, like I mentioned earlier, has its own unique assets. It has its own, leadership assets. So, where in one community you might have a community college, another one you might have a big hospital that plays a big role in the community. It really kind of varies across the state, but all of those big heavy hitters at the local level bring different types of assets and different types of resources to the table that you can leverage for solutions. But if you're going to be able to use those resources and assets, you have to be really deliberate about understanding what role they play in the challenge that you have and what you need to do in order to activate those. So that kind of collaboration and planning is, I can't overstate how important that is to being effective down the road. We have a lot of really great examples of creative housing developments that have happened over the last few years where employers were major investors or where philanthropy played a big role or where just a group of volunteers, frankly, were able to pull together a development. But it plays out differently community to community based on who's there, who's at the table, and what assets the community has. So if communities are going to be able to do that, they have to understand kind of what the lay of the land is in order to be able to take advantage of new funding opportunities and private investment. That requires sort of a progression of what we have been calling readiness. So when communities are ready for investment, it's because they have identified the needs in their community. They've prioritized the biggest needs and some of the biggest opportunities. They've identified partners and they've brought those partners to the table to talk about what assets they're sharing. They've developed a viable plan for activating some of those assets. They've developed some specific project ideas. So maybe that's a property, an underutilized property, that has a lot of redevelopment potential. And they have identified essentially what kind of dollars are needed to make that project happen. So a lot of times when I'm talking with groups, there's this sense of frustration that there's all of these grant dollars out there, there's potential private investment, but they haven't been successful in accessing those. Their grant applications aren't competitive. They don't have match dollars or initial investment to attract more private dollars. And I would say that all of those conversations happen at the tail end of any process, any project development process. We really need to start thinking about these challenges from the very beginning, where we're understanding our needs and developing the plans based around them. So I just want to kind of make that note about readiness, because it's something that we talk about a lot in communities. It's really hard to just kind of jump into the deep end of the pool and look for grant dollars or private investors if you haven't done that upfront work. So that is easier said than done, however, and we know that rural communities really struggle with that whole planning process and grant application process, because there isn't as much organizational capacity or organizational infrastructure available in rural communities. So what we mean by capacity is generally, do you have the time? Do you have the staff? Do you have the staff who has the right knowledge or set of expertise? Do you have someone who can do the reporting for a grant? Do you have someone who can write the grant application? And a lot of times the answer is no. You have a village manager or village president who's doing 6 different jobs and putting out fires, sometimes literally, and they can't fit this into their schedule. So grant applications are being kind of just slotted in where people have time, and the planning work that I mentioned earlier often doesn't happen. So this is a real issue for rural communities. I have this map here just kind of as a general reference point, but there's been national efforts to kind of map out where we are missing capacity, and it's no surprise, it's generally in rural communities. So we know that we have to address that capacity gap if we're going to do the planning and develop the projects that we need to address big challenges like housing and workforce. And that's really where the Office of Rural Development has kind of positioned itself. So when I first came into this position a little over a year ago, I was the only person. And so I was out there talking with communities about things like housing and broadband and infrastructure, all these really big, complex challenges. And everyone was like, how are you going to fix that? You're one person. And the answer is, I'm not going to fix it. But we are trying to find ways that we can change sort of the process and the thinking across all of those different issue areas to prepare communities for solutions. So that readiness and capacity building is really where we're putting our focus. We're helping communities build capacity, do the plans by making connections and to some extent providing funding for that kind of activity. One of the ways that we're doing that is creating a lot of connections between communities and other resource providers like state and federal agencies, philanthropy, universities, private sector partners, anyone who can bring something to the table for rural communities. We're making sure that rural communities have that connection and that they understand what resources are available. There's a lot of resources and programs that rural communities can take advantage of, but if they don't have those connections, they don't have those relationships, and they don't have a good understanding of what's available, they're not going to be able to take advantage of that. So what we're really trying to be a front door for a lot of the resources that are out there, and help navigate and triage for rural communities as they're kind of working their way through some of these processes and funding opportunities. So that's a big part of what we do. And the other, like I mentioned earlier, is really being a rural voice in the policy and program development conversations that are happening in Lansing. So the shortest way to explain what it is that we are and do is we're kind of a connector or a liaison between rural communities, state and federal agencies, and other rural partners. So we're not exactly a one-stop shop, but we're kind of a portal for for rural communities who are working through some of these bigger problems. One of the things, though, that we are developing programmatically in our office is a grant program called the Rural Readiness Grants. And this is, again, focused on rural readiness and capacity building to try to prepare communities for new investment, to help them develop projects, to help them connect to partners and other sources of funding. So we're providing up to $50,000 for projects that are doing those kinds of capacity building activities, that are engaging those diverse partners and preparing properties and projects for development. It's a really flexible project or program, and we've made it available to pretty much any tax-exempt organizations. We launched the program in April and just kicked off the second round end of July. So we're doing it in a two-phase process for each round. So communities submit a letter of intent, which is a really simple 1 or 2 pages summary of what the project is. Those letters of intent are ranked, and then if you make it through that process, you're asked to submit a full application that's lengthier. So we have a total of about $1.5 million for both rounds total. So not a lot of funding, but we are running this kind of as a pilot because it's a very unusual grant program in terms of the types of things that we're funding and the amount of flexibility that we've built into it. And we're hopeful that we can prove some successes with this and be able to offer this in the future as well. So if you have more questions on that, I have the website here on the screen, but also feel free to reach out to me or other Office of Rural Development staff with any questions about whether your project might apply for that grant program. Another thing that we're trying to do, and I'm just kind of running through our programming real quick before opening it up to food and questions, is we're developing what we're calling a roadmap that will identify some of those bigger economic and demographic trends that we're experiencing, as well as some of the best practices that can address the challenges that rural communities are experiencing, and some of the policy and resource needs to handle them effectively. So what we really want to do is create a shared understanding of what rural communities are experiencing right now, and what they need financially and policy-wise in order to address it. So what kinds of money do we need, and for what activities, and what are the barriers standing in the way of actually getting things done around these big rural needs. We have been kind of developing that understanding ourselves at the Office of Rural Development by conversations like this, talking with people in groups or one-on-one. We also, like Katie said, did a series of rural leadership summits over the last few weeks of July, where we had these conversations and asked for input from communities about what they need and what they're working on. We also did a survey that went out all over the state that asked people about, what is your experience as a rural resident or a rural business? What do you need to be successful? And we're using all of those engagement opportunities to build this report, and really want to emphasize that we want everyone in Michigan to understand what rural communities are experiencing. So I came into this kind of naively thinking that everyone gets what's happening in rural Michigan. I live it and breathe it, and so I expect that other people have the same experience. But I find more and more that's not the case. And so we really need to do just some general education about what are the needs that rural Michigan has, and some of the unique barriers to success in rural communities, so that we can get to some of those bigger policy solutions. So I really want to emphasize just the importance of having these conversations and sharing, kind of what you're working on, and how we can help and how the state can be helpful, in addition to helping you with other resources from other partners as well. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I just always appreciate the back and forth. I don't know if we want to take a break for the food and then come back to Q&A, or if I'll kind of leave it to you. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.